A reporter tried to embarrass Prince on live television with a joke about his height, but his comeback was so devastating, so perfectly delivered, that the entire studio fell into a silence that would be replayed for decades. The moment mockery became admiration, and a bully learned what real power looks like. The show was called Morning Talk, a local Minneapolis program that had recently gone national, riding the wave of talk show popularity in the early 1980 seconds. The host was Mark Sullivan, 6'3", former college basketball player, the kind of man who'd built his entire identity on physical dominance and the casual cruelty that tall men often don't realize they're inflicting on everyone they literally look down upon. Prince had just released his fourth album, was starting to break through commercially, but wasn't yet the global icon he'd become. Still young enough that interviews made him nervous, still raw enough that mockery could wound, still building the armor that would later make him untouchable. He sat in the guest chair looking exactly like Prince's purple suit, perfectly styled hair, 5'2" of concentrated genius, wearing heels that added another 3 inches, but still left him shorter than most people in the room. Sullivan introduced him with that performative enthusiasm talk show hosts perfect, making it clear through tone alone that he didn't take Prince seriously, not as an artist, certainly not as a man. Because in Sullivan's world, the world of sports and traditional masculinity and casual homophobia disguised as humor, someone like Prince didn't deserve respect. He deserved to be a punchline. The interview started normally enough. Questions about the album, about his influences, about his process. Prince answered thoughtfully, carefully, giving real responses to questions that weren't designed to elicit real conversation, but rather to set up whatever bit Sullivan had planned. And everyone could see it coming. The band could see it. The audience could see it. Even the camera operators could see it the way Sullivan kept glancing at his notes, smiling that smile that meant he was about to say something he thought was clever, something he'd probably rehearsed in front of a mirror, convinced it would kill. 15 minutes into the interview, Sullivan leaned back in his chair, gestured casually at Prince like he was pointing out a curiosity rather than a person, and said, "So, Prince, I gotta ask, and the audience is wondering too, how's the weather down there? Do you need a booster seat? Because from where I'm sitting I can barely see you over the desk." The audience laughed. Not everyone, but enough. The uncomfortable laugh of people who recognize cruelty but don't know how to respond to it when it's disguised as comedy. Sullivan was grinning, pleased with himself, waiting for Prince to laugh along, to play the good sport, to accept his place in the hierarchy that men like Sullivan had built, where physical size determined worth, and anyone who didn't measure up literally was fair game for mockery. Prince didn't laugh, didn't smile, sat completely still for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable, longer than television usually allows, longer than Sullivan expected. The host's grin started to falter. He glanced at his producer off camera, suddenly uncertain, suddenly realizing that maybe this hadn't gone the way he'd planned. Then Prince leaned forward, looked directly at Sullivan with eyes that had seen every insult, every dismissal, every casual cruelty that society inflicts on people who don't conform to its narrow definitions of acceptable. And he spoke with a quietness that made everyone in the studio lean in to hear. "You know what's interesting about your question, Mark? It reveals more about you than it does about me." Sullivan tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come on. I'm just joking around." "No," Prince interrupted gently but firmly. "You're not joking. You're trying to establish dominance. You're trying to make yourself feel bigger by making me feel smaller. And the sad part is, you probably don't even realize you're doing it. You probably think this is what humor is. That mockery is the same thing as wit." The studio had gone completely silent. No one was laughing now. The audience was frozen, uncertain whether they were witnessing a comeback or a confrontation. whether this was still entertainment or had become something more uncomfortable, more real. Sullivan's face was reddening. I didn't mean anything by it. You meant exactly what you said, Prince continued, his voice still quiet, but carrying absolute authority now. You looked at me and decided that my height was the most important thing about me. Not my music, not my talent, not the fact that I played 27 instruments, or that I've written and produced 4 albums, or that I'm here because people pay money to hear what I create. No, you saw my height and decided that was worth commenting on. That was the most interesting thing about me. Prince paused. Let the words settle. Let Sullivan sit with his own discomfort, his own realization that what he'd meant as a throwaway joke had become a moment of public education in what cruelty looks like and why it matters. You want to know how the weather is down here? Prince asked, his tone shifting now. Less patient, more edge. It's pretty clear. From this height, I can see exactly who people are. I can see who leads with kindness and who leads with mockery. I can see who's secure in themselves and who needs to diminish others to feel adequate. And Mark, from where I'm sitting, I can see that you're scared. And on 22, Mark C. in live ISBs. Scared? Sullivan tried to scoff, but his voice cracked slightly. Of what? Of what? Of anyone who doesn't fit into your neat little boxes. Of anyone who challenges your idea of what a man should be. I'm 5'2". I wear makeup. I play music that doesn't sound like anyone else's. I dress how I want. I am exactly who I am without apology. And that terrifies you. Because if I can be this successful, this confident, this comfortable in my own skin, without being 6'3" and conventionally masculine, then what's your excuse? What's your reason for not being more than you are? The audience wasn't just silent anymore. They were riveted. This had stopped being an interview and become something else, entirely a masterclass in dignity, in how to respond to mockery without descending to the mocker's level, in how to turn someone's weapon against them through nothing but truth and unflinching self-possession. Sullivan was stuttering now, trying to regain control of his own show. Look, I think you're being a little sensitive. Sensitive, Prince repeated, tasting the word. That's what people say when they want to dismiss someone's legitimate response to disrespect. They call you sensitive, difficult, unable to take a joke. Anything to avoid admitting they were wrong to mock you in the first place. He stood up. All 5'2" of him, in those heels, stood and somehow seemed taller than the 6'3" host, still seated in his chair, shrinking under the weight of his own cruelty, being reflected back at him. Here's what I learned early in life, Prince said, speaking not just to Sullivan now, but to the entire audience, to the cameras, to everyone watching at home. When you're different, whether it's your height, your race, your gender expression, whatever, people will try to make you feel small. They'll make jokes. They'll mock. They'll act like your difference is the most important thing about you. And you have 2 choices. You can believe them, let them diminish you, accept that their narrow definition of worth is the only one that matters. Or you can really know, in your bones, that their mockery is about their limitations, not yours. Prince walked toward the camera, addressing it directly now, ignoring Sullivan completely. I'm 5'2". I've been 5'2" my entire life. I've heard every joke, every comment, every casual cruelty from people who think physical size equals personal value. And you know what? None of it matters. Because when I walk on stage, when I play guitar, when I create music that moves people, none of that has anything to do with how many inches tall I am. It has to do with what's inside me, with my talent, my vision, my willingness to work harder than anyone else to turn what I hear in my head into something real. He turned back to Sullivan, who looked like he wanted to disappear, to undo the last 5 minutes, to go back to before he'd made that joke and chosen mockery over respect. "You asked how the weather is down here," Prince said. "It's perfect, because I don't have to live with the weight of being cruel for no reason. I don't have to go home tonight and remember that I tried to embarrass someone on live television just to get a laugh. I don't have to be the kind of person who punches down, and that mark makes me taller than you'll ever be." The audience erupted, not in laughter, but in applause. Genuine, overwhelming applause that started slowly and built into something thunderous. Standing ovation for a guest on someone else's show, for a 5-minute verbal dismantling of casual cruelty that masqueraded as humor. Sullivan tried to salvage it, tried to go to commercial, tried to laugh it off as good television, as spirited debate. But everyone watching knew what had happened. They'd witnessed someone with real power, not the borrowed power of physical size or institutional authority, but the actual power of self-knowledge and refusal to accept diminishment, completely dismantle someone who'd tried to make him small. Prince walked off the set during the commercial break. Didn't finish the interview. Didn't need to. He'd said everything that needed saying. The producers tried to convince him to stay, worried about how it would look, about the controversy. But Prince was unmoved. "I came here to talk about my music," he said simply. "Not to be a punchline. Find someone else to mock." The clip went viral before viral was even a term. Got replayed on news programs. Became a cultural moment. Comedians referenced it. Other talk show hosts used it as a teaching moment about what not to do. And Sullivan saw his ratings plummet, his show cancelled within 6 months. His career never quite recovering from the moment he learned that mockery has consequences. And sometimes the person you try to diminish has the power to diminish you instead. Years later, Sullivan would try to apologize, would reach out through intermediaries, through mutual acquaintances, trying to make amends for that moment when he'd let his own insecurities manifest as cruelty. Prince never responded, not out of pettiness, but because the apology wasn't the point. The lesson was the point. And Sullivan had learned it in front of millions of people, that respect isn't determined by physical measurements, that power isn't about size, that the smallest person in the room can be the biggest presence if they have the courage to refuse humiliation. Prince continued doing interviews after that, but something had changed. Other hosts watched that clip and learned. They asked better questions, showed more respect, not because Prince had demanded it, but because he demonstrated what happened when you underestimated someone based on superficial characteristics. You didn't just insult them, you revealed your own limitations, your own smallness, your own inability to see past the surface to the genius beneath. The incident became folklore in Minneapolis. People told stories about it, embellished it, claimed they'd been in the studio audience that day, even if they hadn't, because it represented something larger than one moment of perfect verbal self-defense. It represented every time someone had been mocked for being different, every time someone had been judged by appearance rather than character, every time someone had been expected to laugh, along with their own diminishment, and Prince had shown them a different path, had shown that you don't have to accept cruelty disguised as humor. That dignity isn't about physical size, but about refusing to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's narrow definition of acceptable. That the best revenge isn't matching mockery with mockery, but responding with truth, so devastating it can't be argued with. 5'2", in heels, in purple, in makeup, in absolute command of himself and the room and the narrative. That was Prince, not despite his height, but completely independent of it, because he'd learned early what most people never learn, that the world will try to measure you by its standards, and your only option is to refuse those measurements entirely and insist on being measured by your own. The weather down there? Perfect. Clear enough to see exactly who deserves respect and who's trying to compensate for their own inadequacies by diminishing others. High enough to look down, not physically, but morally, on anyone who thinks size matters more than substance. Comfortable enough to know that every joke made at his expense said more about the joker than the joked about. That's what Sullivan learned that day. That's what everyone watching learned. And that's why the clip still gets replayed, still gets referenced, still serves as a reminder that sometimes the person you try to embarrass has the power to educate you instead about cruelty, about respect, about what real strength looks like when it's not measured in inches, but in the courage to be exactly who you are, without apology or compromise.